So another Champions League group stage is over. The 2022-2023 Champions League group stage finished last night. Some interesting storylines, some big stories. I think we should talk about a few things that kind of excited me and some takeaways that could give us some clues as to what could happen in the latter stages of the competition. I think just looking at some of these groups, looking at some of the clubs that have caught the headlines this season, there is a little bit of a change, which I think is a nice thing to see. I think this has been one of the more exciting group stages, but I still think that there are areas where there could be some movement, there could be some development, and we'll speak about the Swiss model, which is going to be coming in the next couple of seasons, and why I think we actually do need it, despite some of the derision when it was first announced, and notwithstanding some of the more cynical means of those advocating for it. But just off the top of my head, we've got Napoli, who topped the group with Liverpool and Ajax and scored all these goals and have been really amazing in Serie A. You got Club Brugge, who progressed to the Champions League group knockout rounds for the first time in their history. You've got Atletico Madrid, you've got Barcelona, these two Spanish giants for differing reasons who faltered at the group stage. Shakhtar, who were really unfortunate to miss out after getting so close to qualifying for the knockout rounds, despite the world of trouble that they and their country has been going through. Spurs, who managed to squeak through their group. Benfica, who topped a group with PSG, and Juventus in that group as well, who were pretty abysmal. But let's look at all of them. So the first takeaway I had is the landscape of European football shifting? Is it changing? My theory is that the Premier League, with its wealth and its influence, has so cannibalized the other leagues around the world that beneath the Premier League, there is now more parity than ever. It is just a theory because, I mean, you think about some of the leagues that the Premier League has taken a lot of players from in recent times. I mean, just even this season, it was the Portuguese Super League. Darwin Núñez left Benfica. Paulinho went to Fulham from Sporting. Núñez went to Wolves, again from Sporting. But, I mean, those two teams have excelled, and we'll look at that. Just looking at these groups. Napoli came top in that Group A. Porto managed to finish top. Barcelona finished in third. And this is another point on that about is the landscape shifting. Spanish sides really underperformed, really massively underperformed. Real Madrid were the only Spanish team to progress through the group stages, which is wild when you think about the period of dominance that Spanish teams had and kind of continue to have in European competitions. That it's not been as bountiful in recent years for La Liga in terms of winning the Champions League and winning the Europa League. But, I mean, last season they managed to do that with Real Madrid and Villarreal respectively. But it's obviously not the heyday where it was basically either Real Madrid or Barcelona that were winning the Champions League. So to see Atletico Madrid, to see Barcelona, to see Sevilla, who are having a terrible season, all drop out is pretty wild. And just on Barcelona really quickly, it's been well documented, all of the financial levers that they pulled in an attempt to create what they would call a virtuous circle, where they could win now and that would generate more revenue to have more beneficial commercial relationships with their partners moving forward. And it really is a catastrophe. Not qualifying for the Champions League 2 years in a row is a catastrophe because they banked on doing that. That's why they were able to. That was the case that they made in signing Robert Lewandowski, and signing Rafinha, and signing Kessié, and signing Jules Koundé. I mean, it's pretty bleak. It really is. We'll see where they go from there. But on the point about Sporting Lisbon, on the point about Benfica, on the point about Porto, Sporting were really quite unfortunate not to get through this Group D with Spurs. I think they lost on the last group day against Frankfurt. But Porto finished top and Benfica finished top. Benfica, who finished top of a group with PSG and Juventus. Juve are in a similarly difficult position. Yes, they've had injuries Federico Chiesa hasn't played for a long time. Paul Pogba hasn't played since his injury in pre-season. He announced this week that he's going to be out of the World Cup. But that Juventus team should still be good enough to compete with Benfica. But to finish 11 points behind Benfica in the group, to just get Europa League football because Benfica put 6 past Maccabi Haifa, terrible, absolutely terrible. And Andrea Agnelli, who's the Juventus CEO, is not fond of sacking managers mid-season, which I think is the only reason why Massimiliano Allegri's still got his job, because it's pretty bad. And weirdly, I think they would have preferred just to be out of Europe altogether. But the Europa League is going to be an interesting competition this year. But back to Benfica, just a really good team. Sorry for the lack of insight, but you watch the games that they played against PSG in particular, and they held their own. That Rafa Silva, I think, is the one that got a lot of acclaim for some of his performances. But this is a team that's doing amazingly well in the league, but is just not intimidated. We haven't really seen Portuguese sides show this much authority in the Champions League, that normally one or two of them get through, either Porto or Benfica, sometimes both. But for both of them to win the group in the way that they did is amazing. And Benfica needing to score all those goals to come top and actually doing it is pretty wild. Maybe the group stages should change. Now, people think, or I've read some takes saying that this has been one of the best group stages in recent years. And a part of me does agree with that, as we've just spoken about some of the surprise names in the knockout rounds. Some of the teams that have topped groups, surprisingly. That being said, a lot of it was already done by match day 5. Just going through it. Napoli, Liverpool had already qualified. Porto, Club Brugge had already qualified. Bayern and Inter had already qualified. Group D was all up for grabs. Chelsea had already qualified. Real Madrid had already qualified. City and Dortmund had already qualified. And Benfica and PSG had already qualified before this match day had even started. I think that's a problem. Do I think this new model is going to solve it? This new Swiss model where you have 36 instead of 32 teams. Every team plays 10 matches, 5 at home, 5 away against 10 different opponents. You're ranked depending on your past performance, your UEFA coefficient. And obviously, the big proponents of these teams, of this system, big teams in Europe, want to do this because they get more games. Juve, for example, are out of the competition and have only played 6 games. I say only because they could be just as bad in 2 years' time, but play 10 games and get almost the same amount of revenue. So that's one reason why they want to do it. But I do think it could provide a little bit more excitement, because in that system, the top 8 teams go through to the next round. Then the next 16 teams have to play a playoff to decide who gets those final 8 spots. I think there'll be more to play for towards the back end of the competition, towards the back end of the group stages. Looking really quickly, and we'll come back at this, but this is 538's odds on who's going to win the Champions League and whatnot. Let's apply this to 2 years' time, right? If we just take the top 8 teams, City, Bayern, Real Madrid, PSG, Liverpool, Napoli, Chelsea, that's our 8. We've then got Porto, Benfica, Spurs, Inter Milan, Leipzig, all of these teams. I think it's down to Leverkusen. So we would potentially have Porto down to Leverkusen. These teams playing a one-off playoff. I think that could be pretty exciting. And it would also mean that there's still stuff to play for, that depending on where you are in the rankings, I imagine will depend on whether you have a home tie. Stuff like that, which could make the final few match days a little bit better than what we've had, accepting still that this has been a pretty good group stage. Third point, City, Bayern Munich, more so City, are pretty inevitable. Let's go back to some of these odds. 538, who do a lot of great work, obviously, in politics. They're pollsters. They have these great models that predict stuff. But they are, according to their model right now, City and Bayern Munich, respectively, 40 and 39% chance of making it to the final, which is wild. Real Madrid and PSG are next up, 18 and 17%. Those two teams that I mentioned first, City and Bayern Munich, 25 and 24% chance of winning the final, with Real Madrid, PSG, and Liverpool in the same ballpark, 8, and 7%. And then you got Napoli, Chelsea, Porto. It's just interesting how City are always the favourites to win the Champions League, and of course they've never done it. I think they get less stick for not winning the Champions League than PSG. It's just an observation of mine. But they do look pretty well set up. They've just absolutely strolled this group stage. One thing you would say in PSG's favour is that they've had more to do. They've ended up finishing second. And let's speak about PSG, because I think a post-prime Messi is back. I think a lot of people like me thought that he was gone. Last season, his first season in Paris, he had, 26 goal contributions from 34 games, which it's not that bad. But, it's Messi, so we all thought he was like a corpse or something. This season, he's already matched it, but in 18 games. And PSG look like a better team. I think they do. Now, in some respects, they are a little bit unfortunate not to top that group. Benfica, as mentioned before, did brilliantly. But PSG's team, especially their front line, are just looking stronger, are looking more creative. How much of that is to do with the World Cup? I think a fair bit. This is Messi's last dance with Argentina in Qatar. This is Neymar's last dance with Brazil, probably in Qatar. I think that's sharpened the mind. They look a more potent attacking outfit. They've scored... They are the fourth highest scorers, 16 goals from an XG of 8.3, which shows the threat, shall we say. In finishing second, PSG have got a task now, because their round of 16 opponents could be City, Real Madrid, Chelsea, Spurs, Bayern, Porto, Napoli. They'll be very annoyed to have finished second. There are a couple of, with all due respect to Porto, there are a couple of gimmies in there, even with all due respect to Spurs. It just feels like we're going to get PSG Man City round of 16. That would be fun, wouldn't it? And just the last point I'll make is is the knockout stages of the Champions League this year going to be the greatest after the Lord Mayor show of all time? We have a World Cup separating the Champions League group stages and the knockout rounds. That's pretty stupid, to be perfectly honest with you. Just anecdotally, thinking back to how players like Mohamed Salah performed after after AFCON. Badly, I should say. That we just have no idea how this is going to affect players. We have no idea just the mindset players are going to be in. By that point, because the World Cup is going to, the first round of Premier League games are on Boxing Day. So they would have had a couple of months, 1 month until the round of 16 kicks back up again, middle of February. So in terms of where in the calendar the games are, none of that's been affected. They always take place in February, the round of 16 games. It's just going to be interesting, the extra mileage, the mental fatigue. Some team's going to win it, and some group of players are going to be ecstatic coming back, but then others are going to... I can't even begin to imagine how this is going to affect the latter stages of the Champions League, but it will in some way. It will. If I was to put my money on someone, Real Madrid. They're probably going to win it again, aren't they?